What are the limits to growth? Dear Lily, if a woman marries at about 16, survives until about 40, and has regular sexual intercourse, she will, on average, have at least a dozen live births. Even if half the children die soon after birth, each married couple will have at least 6 descendants. You can see that if this happened for many generations, the population would grow very fast indeed. Human beings, like many animals, have the reproductive capacity to increase their populations in a way that leads to what is often called exponential or non-linear growth. That is to say, it follows a sequence 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. The curve of growth becomes steeper and steeper. We can see this happening today. While it took over 100,000 years for human populations to reach 6 billion, it will only take one further generation to reach 9 or perhaps 10 billion. What are the laws of population? Populations in history were periodically decimated by 3 types of disaster: war, famine, and disease. People kill each other and destroy their means of livelihood. Famines and food shortages lead to deaths or to a decline in births. Diseases kill many others. There has been an alternating pattern in history. Some large accident or invention occurs. A new source of food is discovered: rice, potatoes, maize, herrings. Or new ways to grow and harvest plants are developed. There will be a boost to the food supply. Health will improve. People can afford to marry younger, and their infants will survive. There will be a spurt in the population growth. For a time, there may be a golden age. Then, at a certain point, the population will build up to such a level that it will usually trigger what we would now call negative forces. People will jostle up against each other, and there will probably be violence and war. They will overexploit the seas and lands, and a slight shift in weather patterns will lead to famine. As populations build up, they will also face another basic problem. There is a biological law that microorganisms multiply and vary much more rapidly than long-living species such as humans. Their natural ability to do this means that as human societies succeed in building up their populations, the microorganisms that predate on them build up and vary even faster. Their human hosts crowd together and create a rich material culture of other animals, clothing, food, drink, and masses of excrement. In these conditions, the normal tendency is for the vectors which carry the bacteria and other organisms, flies, lice, fleas, to multiply. The viruses, which survive only with high population densities, also thrive. Hence, there has been a strong tendency through human history for most diseases to increase in variety and incidence. Humans are the prey, and as they increase in numbers, so do the organisms that live in and off them. This is a law that is likely to halt the development of all human civilizations. It did so to an extent in the past with bubonic plague, malaria, and dysentery. It may be doing so today with AIDS or something worse. Often these catastrophes feed off and exacerbate each other. Ravaging armies cause famine and spread disease. The population then collapses with huge suffering. The cycle will then repeat itself. This explains why, despite the natural potential for growth, the number of people has grown quite slowly over long periods. It is a dreadful cycle, from misery to misery, with brief periods of happiness between. Given the growth in absolute numbers, each time there is a disaster, suffering is greater. 1 million people dying in a war or famine, rather than 1,000. Why does more work often lead to less results? We are constrained not only by our biology, but also by a basic economic law, which is fundamental to the analysis of why the growth of population does not lead to ever increasing economic growth. The law states that in most situations there is an ideal level of work that can be put into a task. After a certain point, however hard one works, the returns begin to diminish. 5 people working on a stretch of land may produce 5 tons of grain. 50 people working on the same area will not produce 50 tons, but a great deal less. An essay you write that is quite good and has taken 3 days to write will probably be not twice as good if you work for another 3 days. This law of diminishing returns is one of the keys to the negative effects of continued population growth. Through good fortune or invention, humans open up a new resource. The first gains are immense. The fish are plentiful. The burnt down forest produces excellent crops. Soon, however, the returns on further input of labour begin to dwindle. The cleared forest gives less and less. The marginal lands on the hillsides are less fruitful than the valley bottoms. This means that after a certain point, a growing population fails to provide extra benefits. Each new mouth after a certain number is a net loss. We live in a finite world with diminishing resources. Are there limits to energy for humans? The amount of energy available to humans on Earth up to about 1750 was very limited. For almost all of human history, the major energy sources had been the sun, transformed through plants and animals by photosynthesis into something humans can use for food or heating. Yet plants and animals can appropriate only a tiny part of the energy that flows down to the earth as sunlight. The development of agricultural systems increased the efficiency of this absorption, but still very firm limits were set on the quality and quantity of human life. Almost all resources on Earth, even air and water, are finite and tend to degrade with use. At first, with few people, there was plenty. Millions of years of sunlight had been banked in the soils, forests and oceans on the planet. But many of these resources are non-renewable, so that with use they decline in quantity and quality. Deserts expand. The mountains lose their tree cover. The seas become barren. Forests are felled. Humans, as they become more successful, exploit nature and often wreak havoc on their environment. Within a few generations, the resources are used up. The movement of humans from island to island in the Pacific, exhausting each in turn, is but one example. Another is the huge ecological stress in China, North Africa, the Middle East, and the Amazon basin. Again and again, the returns from nature have started to decline through over-exploitation. Now even air and water are under threat. One partial response to these ecological and economic patterns is to improve the technology and thereby tap a new source or increase the efficiency of energy transformation. Yet this is also a trap. New crops or improvements in old ones, potatoes, rice, wheat, vines, often lead to an increase in yields. Yet the new resource often leads to a dead end. Thus potatoes trapped the Irish into a situation where they became so dependent that when the blight arrived and aid was refused, there was mass starvation and over 1 million people died in the middle of the 19th century. Rice is such a good food that it encourages the growth of dense populations. The dispensing with non-human labour, a movement away from any chance of industrial development, is a likely consequence. Too much can often result in too little. Resources run out. The problems of initial overabundance of too rich resources are as much a trap as underabundance. They often lure populations down a route that, when it reaches its limit, is impossible to escape from, and leaves people particularly exposed, as we may find with our current dependence on oil. What hope is there? You can see in what a fragile and contradictory world we live. We compete with other species, and often we have been too successful and eliminated them entirely. Yet there are others, especially microbes, that are more effective than us. We are largely composed of bacteria and surrounded by quickly evolving viruses. Although we now have a growing understanding of these through the developments in genetics, this is not a final triumph. One day, microorganisms will eliminate or greatly diminish the human species, just as we have eliminated or diminished others. Another constraint is energy. The first law of thermodynamics is reassuring, since it reminds us that energy is not limited and is irreducible. Yet the second law describes the actual world in which we live, where energy dissipates, becoming less concentrated and hence less useful. We temporarily overcame some of the constraints on the amount of energy available when, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we started to use stored carbon energy. The development of high-temperature superconductivity, of nanotechnologies, of more effective use of solar energy may again delay the final outcome. Yet such tactics cannot postpone it forever. Or perhaps we will have too much energy, and so we will pollute our world beyond recovery. All human activities, that is, the manipulation of atoms and the use of energy, cause what are called externalities. Everything we do tends to leave a deposit, even if it is only temporary, like sound pollution, and relatively harmless. We can see this in garbage, in water and land pollution, and through the use of insecticides and fertilizers, genetic engineering, and the production of greenhouse gases. We all know that the more energy we use, and the more of us there are who are living at a high standard of material consumption, the more these problems will grow. One way or another, either a shortage of the energy we can tap, or the damage caused by the release of that energy, is very likely to trap us. So we shall find ourselves caught in the law of diminishing returns. We will try, being a creative and energetic species, to overcome these problems. We will dig away furiously in order to try to escape from the traps we find ourselves in. It is impossible to predict whether these attempts will lead us to a new frontiers in the stars or into rapid extinction.